Hello everybody, so I'm kind of looking forward to this video today, and I hope you are too. I'm going to be responding to a individual called Katy Montgomerie. Now, I've been aware of Katy for a decent while, possibly longer even than a lot of other gender-critical people have been, because I remember a while ago, and I was just looking back and I couldn't find this video, but I do remember seeing a video on that channel basically saying that it makes sense to use the term gender critical because that's the term that gender critical feminists use. And I was like, okay, that's surprisingly reasonable, because obviously something that has annoyed me in the past is, people who make content on gender critical feminism and never even use the term gender critical or even acknowledge that that's the term that gender critical feminists use to describe themselves or other gender critical individuals. So I was like, okay, that seems kind of refreshing that this is a channel which is acknowledging that that is the term that's used. And if I remember the video correctly, even offering a defense for using that term. Now, I couldn't find that video going back. I don't know if it's been deleted or what. But what I do know is that Katy Montgomerie has now got to the point of not being considered particularly reasonable or even particularly nice by the majority of gender critical people who encounter the channel. And with that said, there was always kind of this idea of maybe I could respond to one of Katy Montgomerie's videos, but the issue is that Katy's videos by and large are actually just kind of news roundup videos. What Katy will do is go through some of the recent news regarding gender identity and try to basically show how it paints gender critical feminists in a negative light, or shows that their concerns are completely unreasonable. Now, obviously I've watched some of these videos some of the way through and found things to disagree with, but I've never once thought to myself that I should make a response to any of these, because it's just not particularly important. Like, at the end of the day, what this one particular news article in one particular week indicates about gender politics, I just don't think matters very much. And I think, sure, if somebody, I think there are, for example, gender critical channels who do a similar thing of doing, a roundup of all of the different news and articles over the past week and look at it from a gender critical perspective. And I think ultimately that's a fine thing to do, just as it's fine for a gender identity extremist to do that. But from my perspective, as somebody who tends to put the focus more on arguments than individual stories, it's just never ever, I've never wanted to respond to any of Katy's videos. However, I recently discovered that Katy has a Twitter account filled with commentary cartoons, like kind of political cartoons, and they are supposed to be satirizing and criticizing the gender critical position. So there are a lot of these cartoons, certainly I think more than a single video's worth, so this is probably going to be the first of a series. But what's interesting is, of course, that these are making arguments. These aren't just covering one particular story, these are actually making genuine criticisms of, being gender critical. So with that said, I was thinking, this is something I can really sink my teeth into. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this video. And like I say, I think it will be quite an exciting thing to do. So I hope you all enjoy, and we're just going to transition into that right now. So as you can see, this is the first image. I'm going to be kind of starting with the most recent and then going backwards. And like I say, I don't know if I'm going to make it through all of them, so we'll see how that works out. But yeah, this is the first image. As for where my face is, it's kind of covering the comments that accompany it. I'm just going to read the comments out from Katy, and then just give my thoughts on the cartoon and explain why I think it's pretty silly. So, first of all, you of course have this image. It's people saying, "I stand with the LGB Alliance," and it's two gay people, then a lot of not gay people, and one of the people, the implication is a fascist, and that's the joke. And the accompanying comment says, "The TERFs will not be part of the contemporary struggle against fascism, Judith Butler." So just considering that's the accompanying tweet, I just want to address one thing, which is, I think one of the issues that gender identity extremists have is that they are, I would agree, more vocal opponents of fascism in terms of, kind of self-description. Like, I think that gender identity extremists are more likely to talk a lot about how much they hate fascism, more so than gender critical people. You know, like, I don't think gender critical people are just going to walk around being like, we hate fascism all the time. Because gender critical people, I mean, by the very nature of the fact that we're gender critical, we're focused on something else, and something which predominantly isn't coming from fascists. You know, basically, while I think that fascists are terrible, and I think that gender identity extremism are terrible, I do have an ability which a lot of gender identity extremists seem to lack, which is to understand that two things I might dislike don't necessarily come from the same source. And in this case, you know, I think there certainly could be a fascist gender identity extremist, but gender identity extremism, generally speaking, doesn't come from fascism. So obviously, because I criticize gender identity extremism, I'm not going to be vocally talking about how much I hate fascism all the time. Conversely, because gender identity extremists lack the ability to recognize that two things that they dislike might come from different sources, they will relate everything they dislike to fascism. So, you know, they'll say, oh, every single gender critical person, you know, they love all these videos about the gender critical people being alt-right or whatever else. So their argument is that gender critical individuals are fascists, or at least associated with fascism enough so that they can be grouped with fascists. And of course, if that's your mentality, if your mentality is one of calling everybody you hate a fascist, then obviously you are going to end up being a more vocal opponent of fascism, because anything you hate, you're just going to relate it to fascism. You can say, well, this is fascism. Whereas, of course, because gender critical people don't do that, we're not going to spend as much time talking about how much we hate fascism. It would be very easy for gender critical individuals to just say that everything we hate is automatically fascism, and suddenly, oh look, we can be really vocal opponents of fascism too. But we're not going to do that, because we value words having meanings, and we recognize that fascism is a specific thing which we would oppose. But because we're not just going to call everything under the sun fascism, we're not going to spend as long talking about fascism as if it's even, you know, a particularly massively relevant political force right now. Certainly it's an issue, but it's not something which is the biggest concern. And certainly I think for the majority of same-sex attracted individuals, what are they more concerned about? The tiny minority of like actual legitimate fascists in, say, the UK, or the massive number of people who think that if you are only attracted to biological females, then you are, you know, a genital fetishist, and that's got nothing to do with your identity as a lesbian, for example. I imagine that they're going to be more concerned about this group that actually has a lot of influence in, you know, the establishment and stuff like that, than they are about this relatively tiny group, even though they'd be opposed to both of them. The other thing I'd like to stress quickly is that I don't necessarily agree with this idea that even if we're talking about actual fascism, I don't necessarily think that saying that you really hate fascism and talking about how terrible it is translates to being the most effective. You may be an active opponent of fascism, but that doesn't necessarily mean the most effective opponent of fascism. And I would argue that gender critical feminists are far more effective opponents of fascism, because they are actually challenging fascism while not, like, basically by not being morons. You know, like, if you are an active opponent of fascism, but you're an idiot, you're not actually a very effective opponent of fascism. So if you're an opponent of fascism, but you're also walking around saying that, you know, women have penises and stuff like that, well, guess what? You're not an effective opponent of fascism, because people are just going to think, oh, that crazy, ridiculous, delusional person is against fascism. That's not really going to achieve much, is it? Whereas, of course, when somebody like me, who is significantly more intelligent than your average gender identity extremist, says, I'm against fascism, I think that's infinitely more effective, because it's saying, hey, you know, I recognize the stupidity of postmodernism. I recognize the value of saying words have meanings. You know, I recognize the flaws of cancel culture, woke culture, all that kind of stuff. But fascism is still wrong. That's infinitely more effective than being somebody who's, you know, neck deep. I don't know what the correct term is, but let's say very deep into the cult, and they're saying, oh, fascism's bad. It's like, that's not actually going to change anyone's mind. So I would argue that Judith Butler is far less a part of the fight against fascism than I am, and than any gender critical person is, because Judith Butler, she might say she hates fascism, but ultimately, is what she's doing, are her actions actively working to counter fascism? No, because nobody respects Judith Butler as like an intellectual individual. So it's just worthless. And then obviously here you have the actual image, which, like I say, is a bunch of people saying they stand with the LGB Alliance. First of all, a lot of them are straight, while a lot of them, only 2 of them are shown as actually being, gay or same-sex attracted. Well, is that necessarily true? I don't know, but the best case scenario here is that you've said, well, there's lots of straight allies in the LGB Alliance, which is like a sick burn or whatever. I don't really want to get into, like I say, I think that there's plenty of same-sex attracted people, and this idea that the LGB Alliance is not authentically representative of same-sex attracted individuals is sort of nonsense. But ultimately, it's just going to be a kind of difficult argument, because ultimately, can I prove that the majority of people who stand with the LGB Alliance aren't straight? No, I can't prove that. So I'm just going to point out that your best case scenario here is that you're saying that even though there's lots of same-sex attracted individuals who support the LGB Alliance, there are substantially more, proportionally more, straight allies of the LGB Alliance. And that's not really a criticism, is it? Now, the final thing obviously I need to address is the presence of the fascist in this group. Now, here's the issue with that. First of all, just on the surface, if a fascist agrees with you, that doesn't really prove anything, right? Because there are fascists who have genuine concerns about, for example, environmentalism. Does that mean that it's wrong to be a environmentalist? There are fascists who are opposed to foreign wars and foreign interventions because they think that really only their nation should matter. So they're like, well, why would we spend our time going off and fighting in other countries? I think a lot of British fascists would be really fervently opposed to the Iraq war. So you could just replace it with, sorry, I tapped my microphone slightly. You could replace this with, we're against the Iraq war, and you could easily put a fascist in that group too. The reality is that fascists, like I say, if you're one of those people who just says, everybody who disagrees with me is a fascist, then I suppose maybe it's hard to imagine the idea that, yeah, actually, there's lots of viewpoints you can hold to where fascists might agree with you. For me personally, because I recognize that fascism is a specific ideology, it's an ideology I'm opposed to, but it's not just this massive boogeyman that encapsulates everything that I'm against or something like that. It's not that difficult for me to imagine that, sure, a fascist might agree with me on some points. I think a fascist would agree with me on a lot of points, actually, because, I think a lot of my points are quite reasonable. But it doesn't make sense to say, well, a fascist might agree with you on lots of points, and therefore you're a fascist or something like that, because it's like, or you can't oppose fascism. Because it's like, well, if you want to argue that case, argue it directly. Point to what specific beliefs there are which in some way make it difficult to oppose fascism or something like that. Don't just say, well, a fascist might agree with you. I think it's probably true that there are some ideologies which fascists just generally wouldn't agree with, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's because these ideologies are so fantastic. It could just be because these ideologies are so stupid that even fascists, who obviously believe in lots of stupid stuff, still aren't stupid enough to believe in this particular thing. Anyway, so that's the actual argument of the comic address, this idea of, oh, fascists agree with you, therefore you're wrong. Just complete nonsense. But then you, also, if you look at the comments, apparently this is specifically about Andy Ngo, who is, supposedly a fascist. I'm aware of him. I don't really know to what extent the accusation of him being a fascist is fair. I suspect it's highly exaggerated. But the one thing I will point out is that I do know that Andy Ngo is gay. So I just think, if anything, if that person is supposed to represent Andy Ngo, then by the way, I'm also not sure about the pronunciation of Ngo. Like, I'm kind of pronouncing it the way I pronounce Nguyen. I assume it's a Vietnamese name. Anyway, point is that if the fascist here is supposed to be Andy Ngo, then why doesn't it show that he's gay? This might seem like a weird criticism, but it's just like, if one of your arguments is supposed to be that this doesn't represent that many gay people, and yet you're also trying to represent somebody who's specifically gay, and you haven't shown that they're gay, then that would just seem like a bit of an oversight. Anyway, so overall, that's a kind of minor quibble, but just the whole point of the comic really doesn't... what is the point? Like I say, some fascists might agree with you. Well, sure, some fascists might agree with lots of things. Okay, so next one. Trans women are men, and so we should take all their rights away. I don't know what's happened to you. I just don't think we can be friends anymore. Friends for 20 years, but then as soon as I become gender critical, suddenly I'm a bigot. Well, yeah, okay. It's a good comic. So, I just realized so far these things are uploaded daily, because that one was from today. This one's from the 20th of October. Also, I'm aware of the likes and retweets going up as I'm speaking, which is horrifying. Okay, so yeah, trans women are men. So immediately, first problem with this: take all their rights away. What rights? Not the right to, like, basic human rights. Are those being taken away? Like the right to free speech, the right to assembly, things like that. Those aren't being taken away. What rights? That's the issue. You say take all their rights away. The only right I can think of that a gender critical person say should be taken away is the right to have society agree with this, notion that trans women are women and should therefore be accommodated as such, right? Like, actually, really, this argument of trans women are men and so we should take all the rights away. Well, that doesn't really follow. It's like trans women are men, so they shouldn't go into women's changing rooms. Well, that just makes sense, right? If they're not women, they shouldn't go into women's changing rooms. This isn't like a, so we should take all their rights away. This is just a, so it's trans women are men, so we should treat them in a manner that's consistent with that. That the, rights they have and the way they're regarded should be consistent with reality. This isn't about taking somebody's rights away. I mean, it's always just so easy to make the analogy to transracialism because it just makes so much sense. If you said people of European ancestry who have, pale skin are white and therefore we should take all their rights away. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's just, you acknowledge reality, therefore we should take the rights away. Anyway, and then you get this response, I don't think we can be friends anymore. Well, yeah, that's completely unreasonable to say because somebody's acknowledging reality, you say they shouldn't be friends anymore. And then obviously the person says, okay, so you hate me because of this. Well, okay, here's the first thing. When I first had people like burning bridges, it was literally when I said, I don't agree with gender critical feminists, but I think they have some points, so we should engage them in debate. That was literally what I said, which caused people to, or caused at least one person who had been a long-time subscriber of mine to say, I can't support you anymore, you're a bigot, and you're basically killing trans people. Because I just said, I don't agree with gender critical feminists, but I think that the arguments they're making make enough sense that we should actually engage with them. And so, no, nothing close to... It took me a while, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of other gender critical individuals, a while for them to ever actually come out and say, trans women are men. Or trans-identified males are men, as we should say. It took me a while to do that. I imagine it took a lot of people a while to do that. And I mean, apart from anything else, you can literally see this happening for all the world to see with J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling didn't just immediately come out and say, trans women are men. Indeed, J.K. Rowling, to my knowledge, has never said that. J.K. Rowling still has not said that trans women are men. And yet people are still, even now, basically, saying that they hate her, saying that she's horrible, saying that she's awful. So this idea that you only lose friends when you go full on gender critical, not that there's even anything wrong with that, but this idea that you only lose friends when you go full on gender critical isn't even true. Actually, it's the reality that most people express some degree of interest or enthusiasm for gender critical ideas, even in a very minor sense, and that's when they get totally, disowned, cut off from the cult. There's no better comparisons, the way like Jehovah's Witnesses will just cut you off immediately if you question any of their ideology. It's basically a very similar thing here. So I become gender critical, suddenly I'm a bigot. Well, yeah, again, not really. It's a pretty weak comment, isn't it? Sick own. Well, yeah, you are a bigot. Why? Because you've acknowledged reality? It's just nonsense. Next one. Okay, so it's a thank you for 10,000 subs. Great. Actually, I will point this out. The implication is that every single person who subscribes to Katy's cartoons is trans, which I suspect isn't true. In fact, the irony is there's probably at least one fascist. Like, if you wanted that to actually be representative, you should have somebody with a swastika on their face. Right, so you have this comment, trans people want to ban the word woman. I know this is what convinced me to become gender critical, actually. And then over on the side, you have a group of trans people. Again, it's all trans people. Apparently the fact that there may be non-trans allies is irrelevant. So I guess that's just going to be a thing that keeps happening. We support all women. Trans women are women. Protect trans women. So here's the thing about the whole want to ban the word woman. The reality is it's more about wanting the word woman to not mean anything. Like, there we go. I mean, I don't know how much I need to labor that point, but obviously, trans women, the thing is, this is the issue, okay? The actual, the little caption thing says, I have listened to trans people, I promise. Again, sorry you can't see it, but you can see my face instead, which is much better. Here's the thing. This isn't like an own. The problem is it's so obvious that you must realize this isn't really an argument. Like, nobody actually thinks that the people who literally say trans women are women want to ban the word woman. However, we recognize that the term woman is being used increasingly less often. So, okay, it's two things. One, the word woman has no meaning anymore. So in that sense, it ceased to function as a word, which is equivalent to banning it. But two, it's about banning the word woman in cases when it should be used. That's what we're talking about. Like, it's such an obvious point. The irony here is that it's a massive self-own, because your whole thing is like, look, they haven't really listened to trans women because they don't understand that we actually care about using the word woman. But the irony is that you're actually showing that you haven't listened to gender critical people, because if you had, you wouldn't be making this argument, because it's obvious what gender critical people mean. Gender critical people mean, when they say ban the word woman, they're talking about instances where the word woman, it would be appropriate to use the word woman, such as, say, if you want to talk about the person who gives birth in a relationship, or in, doesn't have to be a relationship, but when it comes to, reproducing, talk about the person who gives birth, aka a woman. But trans people won't say, no, you can't use the word woman. So when we talk about banning the term woman, we're not talking about banning the term woman from ever being used in any context at all. We're talking rather about how, if there are instances when it's appropriate to use the term woman and we can't use it because it's offensive, that's banning it. You don't have to ban something in every single instance in order to say that you want to ban it. If there are specific contexts where it would be appropriate to use a term and you say, no, you can't use a term there, that's banning. So there we go. I hope that's clear. Again, apparently you don't listen to gender critical people, despite you making fun of, gender critical people for apparently not listening to trans people, even though, it's immediately, you don't have to listen. It's not as if if you listen to trans people, you'll find out that they actually believe trans women are women, so therefore they don't want to ban the word woman entirely. Yeah, you don't need to listen to trans people for that. That's obvious. Everybody knows that. The point is that they want to ban the term woman because they want it not to be used. They want you not to be allowed to use it in instances where it should be used. I hope that's clear. Next one. Get your tits out, love. Excuse me, I'm a trans woman. Oh gosh, sorry sir. Please go about your day unharassed. Okay, so this is a very classic argument. Basically, it's a complete straw man, which suggests that gender critical people believe that gender non-conforming men don't face harassment. Let me just be clear here. Gender non-conforming men face harassment. So, yes, there we go. That's it. I don't think the irony is, it's a straw man of suggesting only women ever get harassed. No, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have to speak to that many gay guys, for example, before you'd find out that men can get harassed. And obviously, if you're talking about, for example, gender non-conforming men, especially gender non-conforming men who go to great lengths to make themselves appear to be women, by the way, possibly even overly sexualizing themselves in the process, well, no, I don't think it surprises anybody that those individuals will get harassed. This isn't an argument against anything. It's not an argument against anything. Okay, if you can find a gender critical person who said only women ever get harassed, no man, whether gender non-conforming or gay or anything else, no man has ever been harassed. Okay, fine. I'll say that person was wrong, and well done. Your comic really debunked them. But I suspect you won't be able to find that many people who have said that. All squares are red and all triangles are blue. What about this one? It doesn't count because it's an anomaly. So what's the argument here? It's talking about the fact that we observe a very, very, very reliable binary when talking about biological sex. However, sometimes certain absolute statements can actually be inaccurate. So there's basically two ways of interpreting this, which I want to address. The first one would be if you say, for example, no lesbians have penises. And then somebody could say, well, actually, what about this biological female who has a difference of sexual development, which means that she has a penis, for example, which I'm pretty sure that's something which can actually happen in science. Well, in that context, you'd have to say, okay, actually, you know what? Sure, some women, some lesbians in very specific circumstances can have penises. And in that context, you're not necessarily saying that doesn't count because it's an anomaly. Rather, what's kind of implied is, yeah, sure, that very exceptional circumstance does exist, but it doesn't really change the fact that, lesbians not having penises is a pretty reliable rule. Now, there is, of course, a question of, well, should you make such absolute statements? I mean, knowing that some lesbians are very tiny, like if we're talking about differences of sexual development, some lesbians could have a penis. Does that mean that you shouldn't make an absolute statement that no lesbians have penises? Well, the reality is that most kind of political statements, most kind of activist statements tend to be overly absolute because that makes them more effective. So when you're arguing against people who believe that biological males can be lesbians, to point to something very obviously associated with biological males, like a penis, and saying, no, lesbians don't have that, is just a kind of an effective way of communicating your message. You don't have to be, it's not as if these people are saying, I 100% believe that no lesbian could have a penis, and that this is a scientific belief that is completely based on considering every possible example of different constructions of human biology and things like that. No, it's just a kind of activist statement being made to make clear the significance of biological sex. So to say, well, what about this difference of sexual development? I mean, sure, that's a refutation of taking the absolute statement 100% literally, but you're not supposed to. You're supposed to interpret the statement within the context of where it's clearly being made, which is in opposition to the idea that a biological male can be a lesbian. Pointing out that some biological females can have differences of sexual development, which mean they have penises, really isn't the refutation that you think it is. Now, the other possibility is that this is trying to refute the idea of the sex binary in general, in which case it fails at that, because differences of sexual development, as I've said before, don't disprove the binary. They actually prove the binary, because they show how even when you have these differences of sexual development, you can still tell who's a male and who's a female. And I think possibly all differences of sexual development, the effects they have vary depending on whether or not it's affecting a male or a female. So certain things which affect differences of sexual development will affect males differently from females. So actually it just proves that males and females are a binary. And of course, yeah, if you did want to prove or try to argue against the binary, you would want to show a kind of half triangle, half square, which ironically, you can't actually do. Like, the funny thing is there is no kind of in-between a triangle and a square, really. So if anything, this does a good job at showing the reality of the sex binary. You're either a triangle or a square. That's all there is to it. And sure, some triangles may have certain differences from other triangles, and even differences that make them similar to a lot of squares, but it doesn't change the fact they're a triangle. So well done. You've given a pretty good illustration of the sex binary. Okay, so this is the comic strip that made me want to record this whole video. You have 4 different panels. In one instance, it's a gender critical reaction to a trans-identified male child wearing a dress, although I don't think a child can reasonably be said to actually have identified authentically as trans, because I think that's something which has been imposed on them, but whatever. Then in another instance, you have a biological female wearing a dress, you have a biological male wearing a dress, and you have, sorry, I don't know why I said that, sorry, you have a biological male wearing a dress, and then you have a biological female wearing a dress, and then you have a trans-identified female wearing a dress. So, let's break this down. In the first one, the gender critical reaction is, stop reinforcing gender stereotypes. Boys should be allowed to wear a dress without being told they're a girl. Okay, that's fine. That's 100% accurate. And I don't think that Katy is even trying to argue against that position in this. What Katy's trying to do is show a hypocrisy. So let's see whether or not any hypocrisy is exposed. Because like I said, I think that first panel is the reasonable gender critical statement. I don't think there's a good argument against that. So then you got this one. This is disgusting. Why is this boy being sexualized? So if a biological male child is in a dress and they are identifying as a boy, then why are, the gender critical position is that they're being sexualized. Well, actually, this isn't true. The reason why people, I assume this has to be with relation to the John Lewis advert, I believe it was. Here's the thing. The reason people thought that boy was being sexualized is because he was wearing makeup. Now, I don't really want to get into kind of the gender politics of makeup, but certainly I think it's true to say that dressing a young child up, or making a young child up in a way with eyeshadow and lipstick and all that kind of stuff, it is sexualizing that child. And, it's perfectly reasonable. I can understand that kids like playing around with makeup. Kids like face paint and stuff like that. Of course, it makes sense that they would like makeup because they're innocent and they don't interpret it in that way. But that doesn't change what it is. It doesn't change the fact that there's a difference between, getting face paint like Iron Man versus doing your makeup or doing a child's makeup so that they look like, a woman about to go out on the town. It's a very different thing. And of course, this leads on to the third panel, which is showing a GC person being completely indifferent towards a biological female child wearing a dress. Now, here's the thing, okay? If that biological female child was wearing makeup, yes, gender-critical people would be like, why is this child being sexualized? Do you seriously think if John Lewis did an advert of a little girl in makeup equivalent to the makeup the boy was wearing in that advert, that gender-critical people wouldn't be critical of that? Because they would. The objection is to the sexualization of children. And by the way, the fact that you think that people being concerned about the sexualization of children is something to be mocked, it's not a good look for you. But yeah, that's the thing. It's not about, nobody thinks that a boy, if it was just a regular boy wearing a dress, nobody would think that was sexualizing. I mean, I can tell you that, when I was a kid, we had a kind of dressing up drawer, or, it wasn't a drawer actually, it was a box, but it had a dress in it. And I'm sure I wore that dress plenty of times. And, I don't think that anybody ever would have thought, oh, that's sexualized, even if it was on an advert or something like that. Nobody would be like, oh, it's the boy wearing a dress, that's sexual. But if I was wearing makeup, proper full-on makeup, drag queen makeup, yeah, they would say that was me being sexualized. It's not the dress, which means your entire argument falls apart. And I mean, just to kind of end things, you obviously have this final panel. How can you possibly be a trans boy? You like wearing dresses. And that's what apparently a gender critical person would say to a trans-identified female. Now, let me just be clear about this. No gender critical person would say that. That's not an argument a gender critical person would make. Now, I was kind of trying to steel man this argument. I was thinking how could this argument possibly even make sense? And I was like, okay, I can kind of get it. I think some gender critical people will often basically say, in an attempt, they want the idea of being trans-identified to make sense. So because of that, they will try to relate being trans-identified to gender expression. Because ultimately, being trans-identified, if it relates neither to biological sex or, let's say, being a man or woman or boy or girl, if it relates neither to biological sex nor to your expression, how you express yourself, then it doesn't really mean anything at all. It's just your feeling, which is just complete nonsense. So I think a lot of gender-critical people will assume, oh, you're trans-identified, presumably you're relating that to some kind of expression. So within that context, I can see how maybe you might, if you weren't really paying attention, think that translates to if somebody's wearing, if a biological female is wearing a dress, then it's impossible for her to be trans-identified. The argument is actually, if a biological female is wearing a dress, then her biology says female, her gender expression says femininity, so what on earth is going on with her identifying? In what sense is she identifying as a boy? What does it mean for her to identify as a boy? That is the question. So it's not, it doesn't make sense for somebody who expresses femininity to identify as a boy. Rather, it just means that the identification as a boy ceases to actually mean anything. So I think that was my attempt to try and think of an argument that maybe Katy is misinterpreting and thinking that it means that gender critical people are just saying trans boys can't like dresses, which is of course nonsense. So yeah, overall, this comic, it's not very smart. It's trying to point out a hypocrisy, and really it's just showing. I've always thought that when it comes to trying to criticize people for hypocrisy, it's a very good opportunity to stop and think to yourself, is this actually hypocrisy or am I just misunderstanding stuff? Because I think a lot of the time you'll find the answer is the second thing. And the fact that, people might say two things which seem contradictory, you might be like, hold on a minute, maybe I'm missing something out here. If gender critical people object to the idea that a boy wearing a dress should be considered a girl because they think that's gender stereotypes, I think you could reasonably expect that they're not going to object to the idea of a boy wearing a dress because they don't believe in gender stereotypes. So there we go, really terrible argument. Let's continue. Trans people think that wearing a dress makes you a girl. My son is a boy and he likes to wear a dress. Well, I don't like it. Okay, so basically, this is, I think, to some extent just a lie. Like, the whole argument here is this person saying that trans people will often appeal to the reality of somebody's gender expression in order to argue that somebody is a different gender. And the response is that this person is actually saying, no, my son's wearing a dress and he's still a boy. Here's the thing. I don't think most trans people would actually say that. That's the issue. Like, when you actually look at a lot of people who are pushing for this idea that their children are trans-identified, the fact that their children express femininity or masculinity is often appealed to as evidence of their gender identity. So I just think this is a lie. Like, basically what you've done here is you've refuted somebody with a lie. You said, haha, gender critical people think that this is what trans people believe when trans people don't actually believe this. But guess what? That's exactly what trans people believe. So, and am I saying like it's 100%, I mean, you go back to kind of like the no lesbians can have penises thing. Am I saying it's 100% impossible that any trans-identified person has had a kid who's a biological male and expresses femininity and not tried to push the idea that their kid is in fact a girl trapped in a boy's body? I mean, sure, maybe at some point in history that has happened, that a trans person just said, oh, it's my son expresses femininity, but is not a girl trapped in a boy's body. I don't think that happens most of the time. I think most of the time they're like, oh, my son's expressing femininity. He must be my daughter then. She must be my daughter then. And then you get gender critical person says, well, I don't like it. What does that mean? Well, I don't like it. It makes, I mean, sure, some gender critical people are very suspicious of gender nonconformity, which is a whole topic for another video. But it's just, again, this feels like another example of a kind of joke comic that doesn't really have a very effective punchline. So basically the premise is completely messed up because it's trying to deny the reality that a lot of trans people do exactly what this is saying isn't done. And then because there's no real punchline, it's just, well, I don't like it. I'm not a transphobe. I'm just critical of the gender construct. Okay, mate, sure. Mate, that's a biologically male word. You can't say it. You're a woman. Okay, so yeah, you have the first comment. The first comment just makes sense, critical of the gender construct. Then somebody says, okay, mate, sure. And then someone says, mate, that's a biologically male word. You can't say it. You're a woman. What I'm kind of guessing here is that people have recognized that we have gender as a social construct and that exists, and that, I mean, it's really hard to tell. I like to think that this is such a niche thing to make a comic about that it's actually based on a genuine conversation. But I'm just trying to think what that conversation could have been so I can work out how exactly Katy is misinterpreting it. Because there's lots of things that could have been meant here. None of which I don't think anybody ever said the phrase, mate's a biologically male word and you can't say it if you're a woman. When has that happened? I mean, I see, I'm assuming it's based on an actual conversation, but I just can't believe this was an actual conversation that happened. Certainly this is not a meaningful criticism of gender critical feminism, because I've never seen any gender critical feminists say anything like this. Like, maybe, I could maybe see this as like, if somebody said the fact that a trans-identified male repeatedly uses the word mate speaks to the fact that they're, actually male, because mate is a term that males are more likely to use, and therefore if a trans-identified male is constantly saying, okay, mate, you'd be like, okay, the fact that they keep saying mate probably comes from the fact they're biologically male. And certainly it's true that I think men say mate more than women, but it does occur to me, I'm pretty sure that Magdalene Burns said mate a lot. Like, I'm pretty sure Magdalene Burns, like, I have like an image in my head of Magdalene Burns being like, what are you talking about, mate? Something like that, you know? If anything, like, mate's just, well, it's a British term, obviously, but certainly, like, there are plenty of gender-critical feminists who use the term mate, and Magdalene Burns, I'm sure somebody could find a clip of her having said mate before, because I'm 100% certain she has. It's just completely bizarre that one of the most famous, in fact, the most famous gender-critical YouTuber used the term mate in her videos, and yet your argument against gender-critical feminism is that gender-critical feminists apparently think that women shouldn't be allowed to use the word mate. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, next comic. When I say I like frogs, I want you to know it means I think trans people are perverts. Okay. I like frogs. So you're a transphobe? OMG, trans people think everyone who likes frogs is a transphobe. Okay. So this is talking about the concept of dog whistles. Basically, one of the ways that dog whistles work is that by establishing an association between a on the surface reasonable statement and a belief that's actually pretty dodgy, you can basically make it so that people who are against the dodgy statement come across as looking unreasonable. The issue here is that gender critical people don't do this. When gender critical people say a statement, it's because they believe that statement. When gender critical people believe something, they tend to say it. Like, I'd be interested to know what kind of gender critical dog whistles there are actually supposed to be. When gender critical people say that they think biological sex is important, they're saying biological sex is important. If that gender critical person also believes that, for example, trans people are perverts, then they'll say trans people are perverts. Now, you know, certainly I think the term pervert's a bit loaded, but definitely there's a strong argument to be made that, you know, the whole hashtag it's a fetish thing, there's a lot of legitimacy there. But let me tell you, gender critical people will be perfectly happy pointing out that it's a fetish. So this idea that it's all dog whistles, it just makes no sense. You think it's a dog whistle because your immediate reaction is to overreact to everything. So you think when somebody says that biological sex is important to them, that means they're secretly trying to say something horrible to you, because that's what you do, you overreact to stuff. So actually the final comment is completely reasonable, for somebody to say, hey look, this crazy person thinks that anyone who says this mild thing is automatically a transphobe. Even then, you know, I've pointed out before, transphobe, it doesn't mean anything, it's a completely useless term. We want to ban trans people from the public spaces they use today. Ban healthcare for kids, take away protections. What healthcare for kids? Take away protections against transphobia, legally protect misgendering and transphobic harassment. Cool, I publicly support you. Why are trans people calling you transphobic? I have no idea, I support trans-identified people. Okay, well, I'll just write that in my article then. Okay, so I guess the story there is, you know, I mean, I'm 100% on board with the first comment, apart from the whole ban healthcare for kids, because it's not healthcare. But, everything else is awesome. So, you know, I 100% am on board with that XX thing. As for, I know the organization now, I just can't think who they are. But I know what this is referring to. And then someone says, yeah, I support, yeah, okay, great. Now, as for this comment, I have no idea I support trans-identified people. Well, to be fair, I do wish that people would come out and I think there is a problem with gender critical people not just owning, like, the fact that what was said in the first panel is completely reasonable. But at the same time, I do think it's kind of funny. I don't know, yeah. I mean, this is probably the most legitimate criticism so far, in that I think that gender critical, like, for me personally, if somebody said, why are people calling you transphobic? I'd be like, well, I guess it's because I don't think that biological males are women, and I basically oppose, you know, the entire idea of people being able to be a different, like, you know, being a man if they're a female, or being a woman if they're a male. All that kind of jazz. Like, I wouldn't be like, oh, I don't know why they're calling me. I know why they're calling me it. I just think it's stupid of them to do so. So, you know, I do think, like, the feigning ignorance thing, sometimes it's inaccurate. But the funny thing is that actually saying I support trans-identified people, that doesn't contradict this. You know, I support trans-identified people because I don't think that the things which I, you know, want to take away, with the biggest air quotes around that, take away from them are good things for them. You know, I support trans-identified people because I want them to embrace reality, the same way that I would do if I supported any other group of people. So, yeah, actually the reality is, I think saying I have no idea is inaccurate and it's feigning ignorance because, of course, you should acknowledge, well, I know why. It's because they're crazy and they're mental, and they think that these very reasonable things that I support, as shown in, the first panel, they think that these things are actually bad. But guess what? I still support trans people, or trans-identified people. Well done. And then, the journalist can write it in their article, and that's fine. So probably the most legitimate criticism, just based on the whole I have no idea thing. It's like, well, I think you do have an idea, but at the end of the day, the journalist can write what they want. I guess maybe as a criticism of journalism, they could write more. Okay. The British News, trans bad by a gender critical person. Trans bad, King News, trans bad, other news, abortion bad. Let's hear from our fourth gender critical guest this morning, trans bad. Then somebody with a stick says trans bad, and the gender critical person says, well, this has nothing to do with me. Okay. Two things. First of all, this is obviously extremely exaggerating the relevance of gender critical people in the media. But aside from that, fourth gender critical guest this morning. These people are so delusional. I don't really get the other news abortion bad. Like, I'm not sure what's supposed to be happening there. Like, it's got nothing to do with each other. Okay, yeah, no, actually, let's read the comments here. I don't know how you can possibly say that 5 years of uncritically platforming unopposed transphobia has caused people to be more transphobic. Stop being hyperbolic. Here's the thing. If we talk about the people who are likely to be attacking physically trans-identified people, it's biological males. So did biological males suddenly start listening to and taking seriously radical feminists? I mean, I take seriously radical feminists, but I think I'm the exception for that, right? And the funny thing is, I don't beat up trans women or trans-identified people in general. So yeah, this idea of it just makes no sense. Like, literally, let me be 100% clear. If that was actually happening, that person beating up that trans-identified person, I would probably intervene. But as I was doing so, I would make clear to look at everybody involved and say, by the way, this has nothing to do with my intellectual opposition to the ideas of gender identity extremism. Just for the record, the fact that this crazy man is beating you up right now, if he got it from me, he got some pretty mental ideas from me, and I can't be held responsible. Like, if he seriously misinterpreted me saying what I'm saying to the extent he was like, I've got to beat up this trans-identified person, well, then that was on him. Like, that's not on me. But chances are he didn't even get anything he said from me. He probably got it from, I don't know, just being maybe somebody who doesn't like gender non-conforming people. Not sure. Either way, point is, yeah, 100%. 110%. Gender critical views can spread far and wide, and I really hope they do, and it's not going to lead to any increase in violence against trans-identified people, because why would it? Why would criticizing an idea lead to like physical harm to individuals? How can you know you're a lesbian? Maybe you just haven't met the right man yet. How can you know you are straight? Maybe you just haven't met the right man yet. Okay, so here obviously this is basically casually ignoring the fact that of course the whole argument of the gender identity extremists is, hey lesbian, how can you know you're only attracted to biological females? Maybe you just haven't encountered the right girl dick yet. So obviously yeah, this is great self-own. I 100% approve. You aren't really a female, you shouldn't be in women's changing rooms or sports. Stop castrating young boys and mutilating young girls' healthy breasts. They are only two sexes and you can't change. 100% yes, yes, yes. Trans women aren't really females. They shouldn't be in women's changing rooms or sport. They should stop castrating young boys and mutilating young girls' healthy breasts. They are the only two sexes and you can't change. Trans people are all MRAs. Yes, I know. This is the classic. It's some MRAs might agree with gender critical people on some points. But here's the thing, when you actually look at the problems with being a men's rights activist, what are the problems with being a men's rights activist? The entitlement, the male entitlement, the idea that men's problems are more important than women's problems, the denial of the reality that gender depression has been basically against women committed by men. What do trans people believe? They believe in male entitlement. They believe in the idea that males should be allowed to do whatever they want. They believe in the idea that males and the desires of males supersede the rights of women. You know, that's why they want males to be able to go into women's changing rooms, even though lots of women don't want that. MRA. And what's the final thing? They think that men should just be allowed to identify as women, and suddenly they're the victims of oppression, they're the victims of patriarchy. Everything bad about men's rights activism is manifested in trans rights activism. If men's rights activists are for supporting women's private spaces, these are good things that the men's rights activists stand for. You can't criticize the gender critical viewpoint by comparing it to the best aspects of men's rights activism. This would literally be like if you had a man's rights activist or a men's rights activist say, suicide in young men is a real problem that needs to be addressed. And then you had a gender critical person say the same thing. And you're like, haha, this will show the gender critical people. Yeah, sure, criticize the gender critical people by comparing them to the best side of men's rights activism. And by the way, like men's rights activists, they do have legitimate cases sometimes, like suicide and things like that. Meanwhile, ignoring the fact that trans rights activism can be compared pretty easily to the worst sides of men's rights activism. All the things that make men's rights activism horrible and evil and toxic are found in trans rights activism. Let's do one more. I want things to be better? Well, why don't you go live somewhere worse then? Because I want things to be better. Okay, so this is actually a pretty funny comic. Basically, it's a response to when somebody might say, you know, oh, if you don't like how bad things are in this country, you should try living in somewhere else where it's worse. And the response is obviously, well, why would I do that? Anyway, I think I'm going to end this video now on a positive note. You know, this was a good comic to end on, so that was nice of me. To be honest, my energy was not quite where it needed to be for this video, mostly because I started recording just before lunchtime, so I was hungry, and admittedly, like halfway through the video, I was like, why am I recording right now? Kind of debating whether or not I should stop and have lunch first. So with that said, I think I'll just end this video here, and certainly I will return back to these comics at some point, pending public demand. So that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please do comment below and also like it, and subscribe and share. Again, I'm not sure if this was necessarily my best performance in terms of the energy I was bringing, but hopefully next time I'll have even better energy, and who knows, maybe when I go back and edit this I'll be like, actually it was fine, and all of this kind of excuses I'm making for myself will be revealed to have been completely unnecessary, which would be nice. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoy. Please do give on Patreon if you have the money and inclination, and I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons, Port, Clever, Jen, and Michelle. You're all very appreciated.